Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Jewish Renaissance Journalism Inside Out series, which we're running together with the Jewish News and the Union for Jewish Students, sponsored by Dangor Education and the Lyons Learning Project. I'm really excited that this evening we've got an amazing panel with us. But just while we wait for the last few people to enter, I'm going to start off by talking a little bit myself, and then I'll introduce them and bring them into the conversation. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Aviva Dorch. I am the Executive Director of Jewish Renaissance magazine, which is the UK's Jewish Arts and Culture Quarterly, and now the leading Jewish Arts and Culture Quarterly in Europe. We're also in America and affiliated to lots of Jewish institutions over there, as well as having subscriptions from many of the campuses, including NYU, California, and Harvard. So we look at things with an international reach. And a few months ago, we decided that we didn't just want to be reporting, but we also wanted to be developing a new generation of reporters, people to speak to arts and culture, but also Jews who would be able to articulate Jewish stories with a strong voice. Little did we know that was either a very, very good idea to run at this time or possibly the worst idea we've ever had, because as you can imagine, it's been quite a challenging few weeks. We have our emerging journalists on the line. We also have a public audience and many people who will be watching on video later. And what I want to say to all of you is that tonight's panel was programmed before October the 7th. The plan was to address the 24-hour news cycle. And what that meant, particularly for people who were editors, news editors, but looking at reporting when you are absolutely besieged and round the clock, there are things that are needing to be covered. And again, we were also looking tonight with an international remit, because a couple of weeks ago, we did one of these sessions where we were looking more at opinion and editorial from a British perspective. But today was meant to be international. I want to try and hold on to some of those things, because I think particularly for our emerging journalists, but also for our entire audience, it is really, really important to contextualize how what is currently happening in the Middle East is being reported on in the news, both in print and broadcast journalism, within how other stories get reported. So I am going to stick to that approach. We will absolutely 100% get to the big story of the day as we go, but we're going to start a little bit with some more general comments about news and also very specific information from our panelists about their careers and what it is they do and how they approach the concept of journalism. So joining me tonight to have that conversation, we have Serena Kutchinsky. So Serena's joining us from Sky News. She's going to introduce herself a little bit more in a moment. She is responsible for the digital platforms and premium content. And she's going to talk a little bit about the foreign coverage. But one of the things you should know to start us off is her team at Sky not too long ago won the International Emmy for their coverage of Ukraine and what was happening there. So that's how I'm going to ask her to start us off, and we'll bring you into the conversation in just a moment, Serena. But before we do, just to say hello to our other panelists, we also have with us Josh Glancy, who is editor of the News Review for the Sunday Times. We have Jane Eisner, nowadays director of Columbia's journalism program, but former editor-in-chief of The Forward, America's leading Jewish newspaper. And we also have Justin Cohen here with us from the Jewish News, where he is news editor, but also contributes to a whole range of other broadcasters and print outlets on Jewish topics, and has been very much in demand over the last few weeks. So we're really grateful, Justin, for you making the time to join us. So we'll do the conversation in that order. We'll go from Serena to Josh to Jane to Justin, and then open it up to a Q&A for all of you as well. So let's start with Serena and that coverage of the Ukraine that you won the Emmy for.
Yes, well, actually, what I thought I'd start off with is not me, but our sizzle reel that we put in for the Emmys. I thought that would give everyone a nice flavour of our reporting. So bear with me one sec while I share screen and check that it works. Hold on. Oh, host has disabled participant screen sharing.
Just give you the privilege. One second. There we go. You should have it now.
Okay, right. Desktop 2. That sounds about right. Okay, yeah. And share. Sorry, I have to open my. Yeah. Apparently, I have to quit and reopen Zoom. I'm sorry. I'll be back in 1 second.
Okay. Technical difficulties, it never quite goes as planned. I love the fact that even the person who runs the Sky digital platform still has problems with Zoom. It tells us everything. So I'll just say, while we're waiting for Serena to hop back in, what she does for those of you watching is produces content. So she edits and produces content of other journalists, and that's what she's going to talk about. So she'll show us the Ukraine footage, and then I'm hoping she'll also go on to talk about coverage of other stories. I think you're back, Serena, is that right?
I'm back, sorry. Okay, fingers crossed it works this time. Give it a go. That looks more promising. That's what we want. Where is it now? No, I have to do something else. Sorry, everyone. I might give up in a minute. I'll tell you what, I will I'll just start talking and then I will work it out and maybe we could come back and I can play it.
Sounds good to me.
That sound all right? Sorry about that.
Let's start with you and then we'll come back to you at the end of the 4 introductory pieces and you can play it for us before we do the Q&A.
That would be brilliant, basically. Right, okay. So how does Sky News report the war? Well, this is a period of great change and upheaval, not just in terms of conflict, although there's far too much of that in our lives currently, but in terms of the march of history and the future of the planet. There are wars, as we know, in Ukraine, which we're going to talk about in more detail, Myanmar, and obviously now between Israel and Hamas. There is a climate crisis, a cost of living crisis, continual upheaval in domestic politics, and the continued fallout from the COVID pandemic. Oh, I'm viewing someone else's screen now. Okay. Yes. So amid all this, the role of journalism is to cut through the noise, to reveal truth, to discredit misinformation, to inform, educate, and I wouldn't say entertain. I'm not going to go full Reithian because actually in the context of war reporting, I think engaging emotionally is a better way of putting it. It's also an era of great technological advancement with the way audiences get their news changing all the time, as we know, particularly amongst younger age groups. So as content creators, 1 minute we think we're on top of the algorithms and the next we realize they've shifted again and left us playing catch up. So as journalists, we pivot to video, we pivot to audio, and then we find ourselves pivoting back to good old words and pictures. So the truth is that while linear TV and print media are not by any means extinct, they'll never be omnipotent again. And the way news is consumed, and particularly in times of war, is now highly fragmented. But this comes with a democratization. And for younger audiences, particularly, they can access news on the platforms where they also socialize and choose to express themselves. So the news that is delivered to them sounds authentic and is tailored to their interest there. So basically, 18 to 24-year-olds today are much more able to pick and choose the type of news that they want to consume and how they consume it. Whereas in my day, my main option was to sit and watch the stuffy news at 10 with my parents. And I don't really see my own children following my footsteps in that regard. Or at least I sort of hope not. War, as the historian A.G.P. Taylor wrote, has always been the mother of invention. And I think this is really interesting in terms of looking at how our industry does this. So it's true that the urgency of war, the need for information to get through at speed and for decisions to be made under great pressure can spark change. Examples of this, going back into history, are the use of the telegraph in the reporting of the Franco-Prussian War, the use of photos and films in World War I, and on-the-spot radio broadcasts in the Second World War. Vietnam was the first fully televised war, and similarly, the Gulf War, the first one particularly, Balkans and Afghanistan were the first to be covered by rolling news. Ukraine has been dubbed the first TikTok war, with the use of phone and drone footage featuring extensively across all outlets for the first time. So at Sky, we saw a huge growth in our audience during the period at the start of the Ukraine war. We now on TikTok have 5.3 million followers. We watched as other outlets like Vice also saw huge growth. They are now at 3.6. And in that period, the BBC finally made the decision to go onto the platform too, where they now have 2.5 million followers. So on TikTok, Sky is much, much bigger than the BBC, which obviously, we're not bragging about. Sky News has been committed to covering the conflict in Ukraine truthfully and in depth since it started. And our overall coverage of the war was consumed by record audiences overall. Just to go back to TikTok again, there we gained 2 new followers per second, basically. One of the pieces, which is in the video, which I want to show you all later, that I think obviously was what was cited during the Emmy and is what people will think about now for various reasons when they think about our coverage in Ukraine. And that is what the incident that involved our chief correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, and his incredible team when they were in Ukraine reporting on the war and they were ambushed. And we will watch the footage later. I have to say, I was not working at Sky at that time. And now, knowing these people and feeling very close to them, when I watched it today, I found myself in tears because it was just so, we know that when our correspondents go to war zones that they're risking their lives. We know it. But seeing the reality of it so viscerally really, really shocked me. Anyway, they all survived, thankfully. Stuart did get shot and they slid down the embankment with the cameraman, who also took 2 rounds to his bulletproof vest, but he carried on filming throughout. Back at base, and I've talked to the foreign news editor, the head of foreign, Tim, about this. Obviously, it was the most intense experience of his life trying to get the team out safe, and John Riley, who was the director at the time as well. I think that experience will live with them forever, but they made it. They managed to get in touch with local police and they got them out and home, thankfully, although nothing will stop Stuart going back into war zones. More of that later. So that that episode, that report has been viewed when it was published, and it was a very the decision to publish it took a lot of debate in the newsroom. It was not taken lightly, and we didn't publish it straight away when it happened. It was a few weeks later because because of the trauma that our team had suffered, and we wanted it to be presented properly. So we put it out, and when it was published, more than 3.5 million people read the article, and the video was viewed more than 6 million times. And then Stuart then did a follow-up piece because there's trolls on the internet and stuff started to doubt the veracity of the report. And there was a story, misinformation going around that he hadn't really been shot and it was all faked. And he found himself at a birthday party with a young member of his own family coming up to him and going, "You haven't really been shot, have you? It's all, you're making it, it's all a hoax." And so Stuart then had to kind of dutifully show him the scarf and the bullet hole and stuff. And he wrote a piece for us. And I think that's really interesting. And it brings me on to my next point, which is that particularly with Ukraine, we have, as journalists, we have welcomed and used a lot of user-generated content. That's what I was saying about the TikTok war, the first social media war, whatever you want to call it. Now, obviously, if we're using UGC, as we call it, from the ground, we have to verify it. And this has led to the rapid uptake in newsrooms, not just ours, of OSINT, which is open source intelligence journalism. At Sky, we have a brilliant and growing in-house data and forensics team. And their job, I mean, they do lots of brilliant work, but a part of it is to verify, the propaganda, I suppose you want to call it, that's coming out from both sides, because social media has certainly been weaponized by Russia, obviously, but also to some degree by Ukraine. And we need to know, we need to be objective and impartial at all times. So that's a big part of their job. And it's a fascinating sort of new form of journalism. It certainly wasn't around when I started out in newsrooms. And it involves techniques like scouring databases, analyzing metadata, looking at sunrise, sunset patterns, using Google Earth, social platforms and other databases. And I can give you an example, actually, and it's from a piece that we published today on Israel Hamas. It was a deep dive into the terrible events at the Be'eri kibbutz. But we were looking at we're going through the evidence, and there's a photograph that is published, where it's a CCTV grab of Hamas soldiers entering the kibbutz, and the timestamp on it says 5:55 a.m. But Reuters and elsewhere, and us at the time, had reported it as an hour later. Then we were coming back and looking at it and having to verify it. And so the team talked me through how they had verified that it couldn't be 5:55 a.m. because they showed me the sunrise data and the fact that they knew they'd managed to pinpoint the fact that the sun would have risen in Be'eri at 6:37 a.m. So at 5:55, it still would have been dark. So we could then be confident that the photograph, the timestamp on the photograph was wrong. So it's an interesting, that's just an anecdotal snapshot of the type of work they do, but it's hugely important. And actually, when I show you the video, I show you a few links that I picked out as well, or I can put them in the chat as well, actually, if that's helpful. I'll do that at the end. So, we're in a really interesting place with war reporting, because we have more UGC, more citizen journalism, whatever you want to call it, more stuff on socials than ever before, but there's still a hugely important place for our correspondents on the ground. And I think the episode, the incident that Stuart's team went through was deeply traumatic for them, just shows you the incredible lengths that journalists go to report the truth, and why it's so important to have those people on the ground as a filter, as a voice, as, pushing to find out, going further. I mean, since they returned from Ukraine, I'm told that Stuart had a holiday, but since I've joined, we've worked on projects with them in Myanmar, where him and Dominique and their team went undercover it's incredibly difficult to get into Myanmar. So they went into the jungle. It was top secret. Only a few people at Sky knew about it. They went first to a secret jungle hospital, which is what I actually focused my long read that I worked with them around. And then they traveled around and spoke to people on both sides of the conflict. They also have somehow managed to get into a drug lab in the Mexican mountains, where meth was being made, and managed to persuade the meth lords to let them film it, which is, a lot of that sort of journalism, where there's not a conflict or a war, it's access that can really make a piece fly as well. So I think that's a sort of overview. The other thing I really wanted to touch on in terms of war reporting, of course, is impartiality. And I think that's particularly relevant with broadcast reporting. And before I worked at Sky, I worked at the BBC. I've also worked at non-broadcast. I've actually worked at the Sunday Times previously with Josh as well. And so it's quite different actually in broadcast, because we're governed by Ofcom in this country, and it's deeply embedded into our guidelines, our thinking, our practices. And I know outlets like Sky and the BBC are sometimes criticised for bias, usually by both sides, and you can't really make light of war, but in other sort of domestic politics situations, if we're getting criticised by both sides, we think we're probably doing our jobs right. But also, obviously, we don't want to be criticised at all, really. But I'd like to reassure all of you, anyway, we take it very seriously, and it trickles into every aspect of our lives, not just at work, but in our personal lives. So, for example, at the BBC, it was in the guidelines that you couldn't, if you worked in news, you were not allowed to sign petitions. You can't post anything political or anything on your social media. You can't go on marches. Sky, obviously, is a slightly different organisation because we're not funded by the taxpayer, although we are public service. So I checked with my boss today, double checked, and he said, no, it's the same. You can't take part in a protest. You can't sign a petition if you're a news journalist for a public service organization, for a broadcaster, because you have to abide by impartiality, and it's so important. So I thought that might be an interesting little insight into, you know, how deeply important it is to us. And yeah, and final thought is that, you know, particularly the aspiring journalist, hope this hasn't put you off, but the truth is that journalism isn't an easy profession. It is for many a vocation and a way of life, and people are prepared, like Stuart and his team, to go to great lengths to report the truth, and it can come with a terrible cost. I worked at the Sunday Times when the great foreign correspondent Mary Colvin was tragically killed in Syria, and it was one of the most humbling experiences of my career, and I still remember the tributes to her that were paid and the wall in the newsroom. So we all, as journalists, and I think as consumers of news, citizens, we all owe the likes of Marie and Stuart and the many others who do such great work a lot. And whatever the future holds for the media and war reporting in particular, public service will always be at the core of what we do.
Amazing. Thank you very, very much, Serena.
I'm sorry about the technical difficulties.
Don't worry. It was quite reassuring that even, you know, someone who makes their living from digital still has those problems. We'll come back to you in a few minutes. We'll meet everybody else. And then before we do our panel, we'll watch that sizzle reel.
That'd be great. I'm just popping links to the Kibbutz article that I mentioned, and also an OSINT piece we did on Mariupol. So it's a Ukraine focused piece as well. So those are in the chat now. Brilliant.
And you kind of framed the link to our next speaker, Josh Glancy, who's about to join me now, who's not Serena, but Josh, because what you were describing for broadcast journalism is very different from what someone like Josh does at the Sunday Times, not just because it's a print versus a broadcast outlet, but that once a week publication versus that kind of constant feeding content gives you a very different pace, gives you different kinds of stories that you report on. So I'm going to come to that with you, Josh, in a minute in terms of your editing position. But you've also served not as a war correspondent, but as a foreign correspondent, covering the Trump years. And I know just last summer you were in Qatar covering the World Cup. So I don't know if you want to talk also a little bit about what it means to be in another country covering stories as a reporter, as well as your current job, kind of news editing.
Yeah, and I would say I haven't been a war correspondent. I have lived through New York in the Trump era, so sometimes I felt like I was. But yeah, I think I've been extremely lucky in my career. I did 5 years as a foreign correspondent in the US for the Sunday Times, first in New York and then in Washington. And it was the Trump era, so the pace was extraordinary, really. I mean, the man is utterly frenetic. He would tweet 100 times a day, and every time he did, much of the world's media would go into sort of spasms of rage, anxiety, confusion, etc. I was very lucky to be a Sunday correspondent and to work for a newspaper that has increasingly actually pulled back from the instant news cycle. We still cover big events as they happen. But the Times and Sunday Times realized a while ago that it was never going to compete with Twitter or the BBC, or indeed places like The Guardian that are giving away their content for free. And so we had to focus on what can we do better? What can we add? Where can we add value? Because we asked people to pay a reasonable amount of money to subscribe to our newspaper and our website and our digital app, etc. So where can we add value? And I suppose as a foreign correspondent, you have to ask yourself that too. What am I here for? You know, when all the internet is full of information about what's going on in the world, and everyone can read the New York Times or the Washington Post if they want to. So what is the point of being a British foreign correspondent, you know, our man in DC type, in the 24-hour global news cycle? And, well, some people may look at my record and say there isn't one. But my conclusion on that point was that the stuff that really works nowadays is people, amid all the noise and all the confusion and all the misinformation, people are looking for authority. They're looking for analysis. They're looking for things that take them past the fury of the news cycle and make them feel like they've actually been given something original, insightful, and special, and that's why they'll pay for you and not just get it off the BBC. So when I was in America, I had the privilege of having all week to report my stories. So I would always try and go to wherever the place was I was reporting on. That may sound fairly mundane, but actually, if you're a daily reporter, you often don't have the time to do that. I would always try and get my own quotes. I wouldn't just use quotes that are in the American media. I would always try and actually, for me, inject a bit of personality and writing into my reporting so that I developed a style and a take, and people would come to me hopefully because they agreed with that, or maybe because they hated it, I don't know, but they hopefully came regardless. And to not respond to Twitter, to actually not, I actually stopped following Donald Trump on Twitter, which may seem a bit sort of self-defeating, but actually he was a distraction in a way, because everything he said and did filtered through into the wider media. And I think in a way that's what the Times and Sunday Times tries to do more generally. It's not that we don't cover instant news, but we try and find our competitive advantage in being a bit more reflective, taking a little bit more time over things, and doing a bit of a less is more approach. We can't compete in the sort of wider morass of the internet with much bigger news organizations, much more instant news, but we can offer expertise, experience, and a sort of measured, hopefully balanced take on world events. So, I was sent to Qatar, as you mentioned, with the World Cup, but I didn't really report on what was going on day to day. I didn't report on football really, although I did manage to go to really quite a lot of games. But what I did report on was, what's the story behind the story? Or I tried to anyway. So, for example, the question I wanted to answer for people is, why is Qatar holding this World Cup? They've had so much criticism. It's cost so much money. I mean, tens and tens and tens of billions, hundreds of billions. What's in it for them? And lots of people talked about sports washing, but what I tried to do is I went behind the scenes. I went into the sort of political arena and had sort of dinner with all the US congressmen who were visiting. I went behind the scenes at the big games and went into the sort of elite lounges where sort of all the kind of sheikhs and international businessmen were gathering to talk business, and painted a picture of what it was like behind the scenes. And it was easily the best piece I did there, because no one else has really done that. And it was about, it showed you how much prestige and value Qatar was extracting from the tournament being in Doha. So it's that kind of reporting that I try to do, and sometimes I succeed, sometimes I fail. But and for me, that's what a foreign correspondent in the modern era can add value doing, is something that's original, something that shows insight, area expertise. I became a sort of bit of an expert on America to some extent, and I was able to sort of deliver that expertise, add a bit of history, add a bit of context, add a sense of place to your writing. So, when we look ahead of journalism to AI and that sort of thing, in a way, I think what I'm trying to describe becomes even more valuable, because so much will become homogenized. What can the chatbots do? Well, they can write increasingly decent copy, but what they can't do is add humanity, insight, swashbuckle, adventure into their journalism. So, and as much as my career has gone well, it's when I've done those things. And as an editor now, I look for other writers who will do the same. I want every piece that I publish, ideally, to be something that a bot couldn't do, and to be someone sitting at their desk looking at the internet couldn't do, something that is originally and insightfully ours. And if you can do that, then journalism's still really fun and interesting and a great adventure. To me, if you're chained to the internet, I don't know, you're living in a virtual world sometimes, which is obviously important too. But and we increasingly see that those big scale enterprises, places like BuzzFeed and Vice, and places that were very dependent on social media platforms to get their message out, are struggling in the current environment. And it's the places, actually the old school places like the FT or like the Sunday Times or like the New York Times that are really starting to flourish again. So that tells you something interesting about what people really want at the moment.
Fantastic, thank you. So Josh, I'm going to come back to you, and particularly that Qatar coverage as we begin to talk about the Middle East in our panel a little bit later on, because I think there were seeds planted in those articles you did that have really opened up questions and stories now as we've learned more about what that money in Qatar has been doing. And we'll bring you in terms of, I know you're covering news at the moment for the Sunday Times as a Jewish journalist throughout what has been a quite insane 5 weeks and how much that's influenced you. But I'm going to leave you be for now, because I think it might be interesting to have that conversation once we've talked to Jane and Justin. Jane, you are joining us from America, and I know you also lived through the Trump years, some of which as editor-in-chief of the Jewish paper, The Forward.
Mm-hmm.
So shall we start off with what that was like and how it was to both run a newsroom, but run a newsroom with a specifically Jewish brief?
Well, thank you for asking. It was a real challenge on many levels. First was just a very basic thing, which was through the 2015 campaign and into 2016, members of my staff, like many other Jewish journalists, unfortunately, were subject to terrible harassment online, sometimes having harassing letters sent to their homes. Really feeling very afraid. The Anti-Defamation League actually cataloged all this at the end of 2016 and said that harassment of journalists in general had increased in the United States that year because of the campaign, and that Jewish journalists were particularly targeted. And it was hard, especially because a lot of my staff was young. You know, these were Obama kids. They grew up in a different America, and suddenly they were being subject to pretty awful stuff. I mean, I've been a journalist a really long time, you know, and then suddenly you open up your Twitter feed and there's a picture of you superimposed on a concentration camp victim with a gun pointed to your head. I mean, it's scary, and so we had to take that and deal with it, but then also not let it affect us. At the same time, I think I felt very purposeful. I felt that it was really important to have a very strong, somewhat liberal voice in America that represented absolutely the majority of American Jews, and a voice that through our reporting, and I wrote columns and opinion writing, really tried to stand up for the values that we hold dear. And so it was a way of, I found the journalism that we did was a way of dealing with the anxiety and kind of the fear that we had as citizens. We also recognized that there was a lot of America we didn't know. We started a series called Our Promised Land, and we had a story a week from a Jewish story from each state in the Union. So 50 stories. And they were all different kinds of things, you know, feature stories, news stories, opinion, memoir, whatever. And that was really interesting because I felt like it forced us to do what we should be doing. Forward was a national news organization, and we needed to get out of our New York, Washington bubble and write about Virginia and Alabama and lots of other places. And there's Jews in all these places. And that was, I think, made our journalism better and deeper. And yeah.
Wow. So that was then, and then you
Yes.
went on and became a professor of journalism. And again, we might talk a little bit about that later on, that teaching.
Yes.
But you're now, I mean, you are still doing a little bit of writing, but you're observing. And of course, we've had these weeks, and suddenly the forward, your paper, is covering Biden's involvement in Israel and how America is responding with anti-Semitism on campuses and the hostage crisis. What are your perceptions, and are there things you think as an editor you would have wanted to do that perhaps haven't been done, or are there things you look at and you think, wow, just like with Trump, positive things are coming out of an incredibly difficult situation?
Well, I'm not at the Forward anymore, and so I don't really think it's appropriate for me to comment, criticize, whatever, my old newsroom. I can say that I think in this very fraught time, but really it's a lesson for everyone, is that journalists need to be aware of who their audience is. And you know, I've worked in mainstream media. I spent 25 years at the Philadelphia Inquirer. Obviously, I ran the Forward for many years. I now write for Washington Post, New York Times, and in each case, it is important to know who you're writing for. You know, in Jewish media, you're writing with a Jewish lens, because most of Jewish media is digitized. That means everyone can read it. So you have to be really careful in terms of the language that you use. You don't want to sound exclusive. You want to sound accessible, but it is reflecting a Jewish point of view. You know, now I'm not as much in that world, but I write a lot about Jewish subjects. And so I feel you know, an obligation and a privilege, frankly, to explain different aspects of Jewish life. I just did my most recent piece for the Washington Post had to do with you know, a Yiddish writer who is sort of experiencing a Renaissance, and what does that mean? And trying to explain that phenomenon to a broader audience, the kind that's going to read the Post. It's a challenge, but it's also just a way in which we get to be who we are and help, I hope, educate other people who might not understand that. And as we've seen with this war, that's so important, isn't it? You know, to be able to bring that kind of context to your writing. I think it's such an important role for Jewish journalists to play in whatever platform, broadcast, text, digital spaces, but also, you know, to whatever audience they're writing for.
Okay. Well, that seems like a brilliant note. Jane, you've just done my job for me, because we have Justin Cohen next, who is from the Jewish News and doing exactly that now. So again, I think with your permission, we'll come back to some of those questions about how do you translate Jewishness and our positions to a wider audience in a moment. But I'm going to ask Justin, both from a British perspective and someone working for the Jewish press in this moment, but also appearing on BBC, Sky, whatever, as a voice of the Jewish community. What has your experience been like for the last few weeks, and what is it that you think is necessary to do that role? Oh, if you unmute.
Sorry.
There we go.
I mean, first of all, thank you very much for having me, and good to be on with Serena and Josh, our new columnist. I have to get in that little plug, and also Jane, who is a legend of Jewish journalism, who I've known a lot about for many years, but I don't think we've ever been on a call together, so it's an honour. Jane said that during the Trump era, she felt particularly purposeful as a representative of the Jewish media. And I think that it represents how I and the team are feeling at the moment. It's been an absolutely exhausting period, from probably about 7:30 in the morning on the 7th, being woken up by those constant pings on my phone, some of which I think were from Serena's Sky and some from the BBC and so on, and doing 20-hour days, most days ever since. But it's also felt like we've never been closer to the community we cater for. And I think to talk about feeling purposeful, I think there's a lot of people in the community, it feels to me, they're fishing around for something to do, to feel like they're contributing in some way at the moment. And I feel that we've got that vehicle. And I think that's how the entire team has felt over the last few weeks. I want to start on a slightly more positive note. I've always felt for the last, I've been at the Jewish News since work experience, 22 years. Started off work experience, and then I did some work on the sports desk before moving over to news. I honestly believe that I've got one of the best jobs in the community and one of the best jobs in journalism. The reason being, quite simply, that whether it be a good moment or a bad moment, I'm at the forefront. I've got a box seat for the moments that matter most to those that I'm closest to the people, to friends, to family, and so on. We may not have audiences in their tens of millions, as some of my fellow journalists here have, but I really felt those moments that matter most to the community. So on a positive front, for example, being on the plane, touching down in Tel Aviv as Prince William arrived for the first official royal visit to Israel back in 2018, was a moment certainly that I'll never forget. And touring Israel with him from the beach to meeting Netta, the Eurovision star, going to Yad Vashem and so on, were really special moments. And I could see the feedback we were getting on social media in particular in real time, particularly on that last morning when he stopped off at the Kotel and prayed at the Kotel, that famous picture with Prince William wearing a kippah at the Kotel. And then, of course, now, similarly, never felt like we've been as close to the community and to how it's feeling as we are in this moment. And I think that's certainly been the case. But at the same time, during the first 2 to 3 weeks of this crisis, I think also we've never felt more like we've been a national publication. In those first few weeks, we were getting calls constantly from Sky, from BBC, from ITV, but and also from the newspapers, for contacts, for information, for ideas even. And that was a reality that I never thought possible, to be honest. It wasn't one I'd ever conceived of. I mean, even in the Corbyn era, it wasn't like that. But obviously, we were well positioned in those first few weeks to have those connections, unfortunately, with a lot of the families of the kidnapped and those who had been murdered. And the Nationals could see that. So I think in those first 3 weeks, we broke about 25 stories that were picked up by the national newspapers. I'm pretty confident, I'm pretty proud of the fact that that is more than any Jewish publication on earth during this period. At the same time, over the last 6 weeks, myself and my colleagues have done 95 national media appearances across all platforms, presenting, I guess, mainly the feelings of the community about the rising anti-Semitism, about the marches that have been taking place, but also our foreign editor in Israel, again, from day one, was well positioned and was appearing within 3 hours of those attacks on LBC, on Sky, and on the BBC. I think, though, at the same time, we've always been, so I'm going backwards and forwards with, we're feeling national, we're feeling community. Fundamentally, the Jewish News has always been proud to call ourselves a community newspaper. Now, I think for some people that sounds a bit strange, obviously you're a community paper, you've got the word Jewish in you, and it's automatically going to limit the audience to some extent. Again, something that we all accept and that sometimes is frustrating. But I think that the responsibility that comes with being a communal publication has been particularly acute over this period, and we've felt that. So when certain politicians or other figures have been using blanket language to describe things which are clearly not, it clearly shouldn't be described in blanket terms at such heightened times. Things like, descriptions of the police as doing nothing in response to anti-Semitism, which we've heard quite a lot. Descriptions of the BBC as being blanket anti-Semitic or anti-Israel. Those or descriptions of the marches of being hate marches. All of that is demonstrable nonsense. And I think as a community publication with a responsibility and with a real reach into the community on an hourly basis, particularly online, we felt the responsibility to be very careful with our language. But also, I think we have to take ourselves out of the bubble, to be honest, at this point, more than ever. And I think it's going to get even more so as we go along in the coming weeks. We've got to appreciate that, yes, the community might have a general perspective. It might be, it might be feeling a bit more right-wing at this point than it normally feels overall because of the level of hate we're seeing. But we have to appreciate that the Jewish community is a small community. We've got to fight for it. We've got to highlight hate at every stage. But I think that's got to be it's got to be a pinpoint approach. Hopefully, like the IDF are trying to do as much as possible, a pinpoint approach. So if the BBC, as they did this morning, made a really bad error, or if they're, for example, refusing to call terrorists, and it's not just the BBC, I won't name any other broadcasters on this call, we should call that out. We should call that out in a pinpoint way. We should say an error's been made, that, why are we seeing this time and time again? But at the same time, a blanket description of any broadcaster is just ridiculous. It produces hundreds of hours of broadcasting every single week, every single day, across different platforms in different languages. And I just that does get to me. And I feel we have a real responsibility on that front. I think just one more thing before we move on is to talk about different platforms. So, the community, and sorry to use that generalized term, again, I think has had a bit of a fixation when it comes to the BBC because, the idea that the BBC obviously is the national broadcaster and therefore has an extra responsibility. But at the same time, the idea that people's views are so, across the board, are so formed by what they see on the BBC as opposed to other platforms, I think that is to be frankly irresponsible, because that doesn't take into account what Serena was talking about earlier on, the fact that young people, particularly those that are most likely, according to polling, as having some kind of sympathy for Hamas, are not watching the BBC. They are getting their news from other platforms. And I think there's a real responsibility again for a newspaper like ours to develop those other platforms, but in a balanced way. I don't want us, just because people are perhaps moving slightly to the right, or even some people might be tempted to think that people like Tommy Robinson are our friends because they're surveying the scene and wondering who our friends are and seeing Tommy Robinson standing there. I think we have a responsibility to provide balanced content on all those platforms as well. And that's why over the last 6 weeks, but also before that, we have made a particular play for digital, for Instagram and TikTok especially. And as things stand, I'm very proud to say, Jewish News is across 5 platforms, and particularly because of a TikTok following that is growing quite significantly at the moment, is now the most followed Jewish media platform in the world across those platforms, despite the tiny nature of our community here. So Yeah, it's been a busy few weeks, but we certainly feel purposeful.
Well, I've been seeing you everywhere. And in fact, I sent Justin last week, one of my best friends in Boston, took a photograph watching her TV in America, and who popped up on the news but Justin. So then she sent over to me. So we really appreciate all the time and energy you've been putting in. And I know that there are people in the audience who will have questions for you about that coverage and about some of the points that you've raised there. What we're going to do in a moment is bring everyone on screen. I might start off with a couple of questions of my own, but also invite all of you to submit questions. We're going to watch Serena's reel first, so I'm going to suggest watch, absorb, and then if you do have questions, type them in the chat and we will bring people on screen to ask the questions and engage with our panel themselves. So I'll first of all hand over to Serena and then we'll bring everyone online.
Let's have a go this time. Right, desktop 2, that seems to be right. Share, it seems, oh, can you see that? Yeah.
There we go.
Fantastic.
The streets of the city's downtown filled with throngs of people, jubilant that after waiting for months, even years, to gather again like this, they finally had. As the police moved in to break up demonstrations, crowds of people began fighting back. These people have had enough. I think it was inevitable that this would happen, but this is going to get violent where it already is. There's been people being killed, and this is going to be chaotic. An enormous explosion has just come down. It was a monster just landed in between us. We're basically hiding in rubble now, trying to find a way to get out of here. It's, at the moment, it's impossible to move. Their resolve to see the revolution through knows no gender or class. Everyone is focused on achieving democracy, whatever it takes. That's not something you'd expect to see. This is a military starting in amidst the crowd singing songs. Of course, the military haven't gone. It's not over by any means, but I never thought I'd see this in Sudan. Never. Pushing through police lines, it soon became a mad charge. Well, obviously, this has turned somewhat chaotic now. They've actually got through the police lines. They're running now towards the border. They carried their possessions any way they could, charging on. The police scrambling reinforcements to stop the advance. They're fighting a war here and they're losing. This is an absolute constant. This killer pandemic is virtually out of control. It seems you either live and recover or you don't. It's something nobody expected. The Amazon rainforest is on fire again. Whole mountains, hills, and valleys engulfed in smoke. Beneath the canopy of these ancient trees, the fires rage. He wants to put it out, but it's coming at us really fast now. It's not out of control, but they've withdrawn it so. This is an emergency now. Tens of thousands are trying to get through. At the front, they're being crushed. We just need to go from bad to worse here. And there's, I don't know, almost speechless as to what they're going to do about it. Death squads who are attacking civilians in their cars as they flee. They do exist, as we found out.
Okay. Oh, wait.
It's a professional ambush. The bullets just don't miss. He runs for it in a hail of bullets. The 5 of us have made it out of the car, down the embankment, and we just can't believe we're alive. We've been able to... Not a big fire. The car's destroyed. We've lost everything. I think I've been hit. I think I've been here. It's like a conveyor belt of horror, and it never stops. what you can't forget is that we are in the middle of a forest, in a jungle, really, and they're attempting to keep these men alive. This is a fight for life, and the odds of winning are stacked against them. But every day they beat those. Really, no reason for them to stay. It's way, way, way too dangerous. Disaster, probably crisis already. It certainly is. Like other conflicts around the world, there is no end in sight. But here, it's a war taking place largely out of sight. And that's exactly what the government wants.
Sorry if that was a bit traumatic in places, everybody. I hope everyone's all right.
I think I hope that people knew coming on a session like this about the news cycle there might be difficult material. But I think one of the things that struck me watching that, and I'd like to bring everyone else in too, for this part of the discussion, thanks Emma, is for a journalist, what is currently happening in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas is another story. I mean, each of those stories were horrific on their own. Seeing them together like that, you realise how much is going on in the world. There is obviously questions of proportion, of focus, of where the cameras choose to zoom in on. And we all know that there are many other things happening right now, but there is a huge focus on Israel-Palestine. But for journalists, many journalists, particularly such as the team Serena is showing us, or your Sunday Times foreign correspondent Christina Lamb is a friend of mine, and I know this from her. You're going from Afghanistan to Ukraine to Israel, and trying to use the same skills to tell all those stories. Do you think there is a difference between that kind of reporting and what that means for outlets versus when you have people from the inside of a country, you know, telling them story themselves? And what is it that something like Sky or the Sunday Times is doing for the audience? You know, is there a certain perspective or an editorial view? Are you shaping opinion? Are you providing a range of opinion? What are the kinds of things you're thinking about as you choose how to report? Serena, shall we start with you, because that was your reel?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it was all Stuart because it was the real, but obviously we have lots of other brilliant correspondents. No, I think the question of the role of the correspondent is a really interesting one. And you know, on social platforms, you would just go straight into the action. You probably wouldn't have you know, you wouldn't have someone, a more traditional, you know, journalist, a white Western person, probably giving a sort of a voiceover even. Now, I think that correspondence can be a guide for the audience, but what you're talking about, that kind of first person testimony from the ground and what the place of it is. I mean, I personally am quite passionate about that, and I think it's really important. And I think sometimes the most powerful pieces are when you let, you know, the subjects of it speak in their own words. And I suppose it's not exactly a war on drugs. So we did a piece. Mark Stone's our US correspondent, or one of them, and he's excellent. And when I first joined, and my day job deals a lot, you know, I work with all these correspondents, but I work on trying to sort of shape what they do often into sort of a written narrative that will work across, you know, online, on the app, and be a slightly different product, very different product to the TV version. And so he'd gone to Philadelphia, where they had this new straight like opioid called Trank, which rots skin, and it's horrific, totally horrific. And he'd done a really good report, but he had some brilliant case studies, and you know, and one person who was sort of helping them out and stuff. And I was like, look, instead of you writing this up being Mark Stone, I went here and I spoke to these people and these people said this, like, take you out of it and put them in the foreground. So, you know, I was like, write an intro, and then we'll just do it as 3 or 4, you know, vignettes, basically, with a pull quote at the top of each one, and put it in there for like first person, let them speak. And I think particularly with people that are being classified as victims, probably a very overused word, and whether that's victims of war and conflict or victims of addiction or whatever it is, I think it's really important to give those people a platform and let them tell their story their way. Obviously, we're there behind the scenes and we can help shape it. And particularly if people are vulnerable, obviously we have to be very sensitive in how we do that. But yeah, so I think in short, I think there is a place for it. And I think, you know, there is the sort of the traditional TV package, if you like, is one method. But if you look in a digital video and written content across our platforms, it can be much more first person and quite different in look and feel.
Thank you. So Josh, you're taking a little bit of an editorial role now as well as a reporting role. Where do you find the line, both with your own work but with people you commission, between that factual reporting and that giving it colour, or creating opinion?
Well, I've always leaned more on the feature side. So for me, colour opinion is sort of where I have, you know, where I sort of have always done my best work. I think it's interesting, the role of the correspondent, because I think people often are very focused on the subject of the story, but what's also important is the recipient of the story. So the reason we bother having correspondents sending British people to go and live in America or France or wherever it is primarily because they know what our readers are like. They know what their preferences are. They know what their customs are. And so, you know, what a Sunday Times story is, which is much debated, but if you work there long enough, you have a rough sense of what that is. So you sort of justify your presence there. We could use American journalists in America, for example. They would probably be better informed half the time, but they wouldn't really know who they were writing for or how to explain it to them or how to tell a story in a way that would really work for our newspaper and our readers. So that's really where the role of the correspondent is still justified nowadays. But I do think that, again, you know, if you can inject style, color, vibrancy into your writing, again, this is a very like Sunday Timesy approach. You know, we have a great tradition of foreign correspondents, but they are often writers because, you know, it's a Sunday and you have lots of space and lots of color and you want to stand out and you want to entertain people, not just inform them. You want to do both. So I do think there's a role for that. And as I said earlier, increasingly, we have this sort of huge diet of kind of quite overwhelming digital news. So if you can take someone out of that and really give them a read, as we call it. So for instance, the week after the October 7th attack, my colleague Louise Callahan, who was in Israel, unfortunately I was chained to my desk editing, but she was in Israel and did this amazing story about a kibbutz that no one else had, for some reason no one else had found yet, that basically fought off the Hamas attack with you know, there was a guy who was sitting on a hill and he spotted, he goes up there to watch the rocket attacks, and then he spotted the sort of quad bikes and vans coming over the plane, and he sort of got together their defense group, and they basically fought off the attack with only one casualty. It was an amazing story, but it was just told with such style and verve and heart. And I think that's the kind of thing that I always aspire to as well. And you have to understand what a British reader and a Sunday Times reader is interested in to some extent to kind of be able to communicate properly in that way. So yeah, that's what I'd say. Brilliant.
So that comment out about audience. So I know, Jane, you want to come in on that, and then
Yes,
after you have, may I bring Arturo on screen because he has another question for you too that's in the chat. So Jane, yeah.
Sure. Just briefly, I just want to build on what has been said already. I was a foreign correspondent for the Philadelphia Inquirer based in London many years ago. Let's just say that Margaret Thatcher was in 10 Downing Street when I lived in the UK, so that dates me. But and you know, I'm sure if I look back at some of my stories, I would cringe and think, "Oh my goodness, I was parachuting in, and you know, just sort of wrote in a bunch of cliches." But in fact, I think to the point that Josh just made, it is really important for news organizations to have foreign correspondents in all sorts of places. I mean, we used to have a joke at the Inquirer that if you were writing about Ireland, Italy, or Israel, you got on the front page because those, there were a lot of Irish Americans, Jewish Americans, and Italian Americans among the readers. But we were attuned to what our audience wanted. And there's just one other brief point that I'd like to make as I lament the fact that so many American newspapers and newspapers around the world have cut back on their foreign staff, which is that you gain a knowledge about covering other countries and cultures that, because everything in journalism is iterative, I was then able to use my knowledge when I went to go run the editorial board at the Inquirer, when I became a columnist. It builds on itself. And I think it's so important, as we're so interconnected, to be able to have journalists with that kind of broad experience.
Amazing. So talking about that foreign correspondence and the broadness, I know Arturo wants to come on screen because he wants to talk to you about the forwards coverage of Eastern Europe. So Arturo.
Oh yes. Oh, hello. Well,
Hello.
I can't see the text of my question. Doesn't matter. I remember it. I followed the forward for some years, and it was very interesting to see how the forward, in a more interesting way than other publications, would sometimes cover problems having to do with anti-Semitism in Ukraine and in Poland, where that is a lot more alive and a more real, a more dangerous force in the culture in all of Eastern Europe. And so I was wondering, with the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the Western position being so very clear as to being behind the Zelensky government, did the forward come under some sort of pressure or pushback when, for example, there was a story about, for example, a Holocaust revisionist in Ukraine, or anti-Semitism among certain high-profile pictures in Ukraine, as there are in every East European country, of course, including Russia. But was there pressure on the forward to not give any kind of, not just bad, but just honest press about where the state of, the culture of Ukraine and Slavic nationalism in Ukraine is at, given that one is supposed to always lionize Kiev at this point?
Well, thank you for the question. I was not at the forward when the Ukraine war began, so I can't really speak to that. I can tell you that I have written for the forward and for other news organizations about Jews in Poland. And yes, there's a lot of pushback, not from editors. Just the piece that I had in the Washington Post a couple of months ago was regarding a Yiddish Polish writer and a commemoration for her centennial, but also a real fear because of rising anti-Semitism in Poland, or persistent, I should say, anti-Semitism. It's always been there. And oh my, did I get a lot of comments and emails and all that from people who disagreed with the way I framed it. But I did not get any pushback or skepticism from my editors. So I just think that's part of what you have to expect as a journalist when you're writing about these kinds of issues.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you. Well, let's stick with the Jewish press for a moment. Mark, you have a question. I think we'll start with Justin and then we might go back to Jane on it. Do you want to come on screen and ask your question?
Yes. A Jewish newspaper almost went bust because some Corbynites sued it and it didn't defend the legal cases. And one of the journalists is after the journalist got a few facts wrong, not big facts wrong, just minor facts, but they sued it. That journalist is now at a rival newspaper. But I just wondered, I think he used 40 not very good sources. And I wonder if Jewish journalists actually get trained as to how to use sources and on the facts.
Yes. I think I know what you're referring to. The journalist involved is one of the most experienced journalists working in Jewish media at the moment, and has vast decades of experience on national papers, including at very senior levels. Of course, every journalist that's working in a senior position, I'm sure across all the Jewish media has training on legal issues, on other major potential pitfalls, particularly when you're reporting on something like Corbynism, and the many pitfalls that can occur there. One has to be very, very careful. So absolutely, just like any other media outlet, that training exists. That said, it doesn't necessarily have to have been training within the setting of a journalism degree or course. That training could have happened for various journalists within the context of having started their career, and as they go up the ladder. Obviously, that becomes more and more important, particularly if they've got an editor role as part of what they do.
Thanks.
Jane, do you want to add anything to that about the kind of training that's given, or the fact checking, in fact, for Jewish journalists or journalists as a whole?
Well, it's just essential. I'm sure all of our colleagues would agree. We don't just publish, we publish facts that are verifiable and that we have verified. And when it's not possible to verify, then you do your best to do so. And then you say it could not be verified. And that level of responsibility is absolutely essential, even more so now with the flood of disinformation and misinformation online. I think there's an added complexity to writing about your own community. In this case, maybe a Jewish community, but certainly other colleagues of mine over the many years have faced this as well. And you write a critical story, and then you see the person in shul on Shabbat, and what are you gonna do? You really have to be sure of yourself and what you've done, because you're not writing about just some anonymous person out there. You might be writing about people that you know. And similarly, I have had a very steadfast rule during my career. If I'm sitting at the Shabbat table and people are saying things, that's off the record. We don't use that. We don't repeat it. And again, this is particular to our community, but I assure you, colleagues of mine who are part of other identifiable communities have faced the same challenges. So you do have to be careful about what you do, but also recognize that there are some places when you're just not a journalist. You're a participant, you're a friend, you're a family member, and you gotta make sure that you have presented yourself fairly so that you can earn the trust of the people that you're writing about.
Well, I just, if I can add just one thing to that, I think there's another layer there. It's often we'll have a story, yes, where we're aware of someone that we know personally, or people we know personally, or a member of the shul down the road that have done something wrong, that have been convicted of something. I think in those circumstances, I believe we are journalists before we are Jewish journalists. But at the same time, we have a responsibility, I think, within that context, to report it in the most reasonable and perhaps non-sensationalist way that we can. We're not reporting that story necessarily. Well, we're not reporting that story for clicks. We are reporting that story because we're journalists, and we cover the bad as we cover the good.
Absolutely agree. Well said.
Thank you. And I hope my emerging journalists in the audience are listening there. We have a question actually from one of the Jewish Renaissance team. Our producer Emma would like to hop on and ask something.
Hi, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your expertise and experience. So I just wanted to broaden out from the Jewish perspective a little. So I have a friend who many years ago did an internship with CNN, and he left feeling quite deflated because, as he kind of described it, stories would be breaking around the world in different countries, and editors would be deciding what they would focus on, which conflicts, which disasters, like what order things should be read out in, what story do we cover top of the bulletin? Also, like, what angle of that story do we care about most? And it's not that he thought their decisions were wrong, but it's that he came away with this real unease that, like, this thing that we call the news is decided for us by editors. So I guess as editors, I wondered about your perspectives on this, how you make these decisions and whether you consider that a kind of ethical challenge. And maybe, maybe if Serena comes in first, because, that's, you are more in broadcast, but it may be relevant to a lot of you. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it's really interesting, and I think it plays to quite a lot of what I was talking about earlier. But so in my career, when I was at the BBC, I was actually across a lot of youth output, which you could probably tell because I was talking about that kind of thing quite a lot. And then also was briefly at Joe as editorial director. So I've sort of seen and made and participated in news that's more social first, right? Which in theory has is more democratic, if you want to call it that. And is, you're looking at what's trending and what's circulating and stuff, although everything still has to be verified. So I think that's interesting. I have to say I've now gone back to legacy media, but taken the idea was to go and work somewhere like Joe, which is digital and upstart and challenger brand, and to take some of those understandings of news and how it works for younger audiences back to the legacy media. And I do really passionate about that. But I think there is still a place and a need for an editor and a filter. And as an editor, we spend years and our whole careers trying to get good enough to make the right calls. And I'm sure everyone else will agree with me that sometimes we get it right and sometimes we don't. And hopefully when we don't get it right, it's not a total disaster. But, we've all had to live with some of the things that we thought were brilliant. Sometimes they flop, sometimes they fly, and it's the ones that didn't fly that you don't expect to. So I suppose what I'm saying is you need the filter at the top, and editors are still really, really super important. And I'm really sorry your friend felt really demoralized. Maybe you should come and do a stint at Sky, because we are a really nice but there is a change, and there's more of an awareness of audience, particularly in digital, because we have so much data and we can see what our audiences are reading, and we can see what they're consuming and for how long and where they're coming from and where they're going and all that stuff. And that is really important. So shaping it around what audiences are engaging with, but you still do need those. You need a bit of in public service, you have a commitment to public service, and sometimes those are not the big clickers, basically, is what I'm saying. So you need a mix of both. You need your celeb big hits, and you need your serious important journalism. And I think that's a good way to package it up. You need a bit of light and shade. Maybe CNN was just too much shade, I don't know, or a bad editor.
Serena, do you think there is a problem in this idea that everything now is about audience metrics? Because surely our job as a journalist is not just to bend to the audience, but to challenge an audience or to make them face things that they might not necessarily otherwise engage with.
No, well, I feel really privileged to have worked places. I mean, the BBC and Sky. I mean, and the Sunday Times as well. There's a belief in journalism and the principles of journalism, and that's very much embedded in me. And I find, like, when I have worked elsewhere where you are just basically out of commercial necessity having to follow the clicks. I mean, I think that's great, and that works, and some people are very good at that. That's just personally not the type of journalism that I want to do, or I'm good at, I think. So yeah, I think fundamentally audience data is a good thing. It's really good to know what is working and what's not, right? And what they're reading and what they're not, because you can't work blind. I mean, actually, anecdotally, when I first joined the Sunday Times to launch the websites and stuff, then which Josh I'm sure remembers, we weren't given any audience data for about the first 2 years.
Luckily, I think.
Yeah, I mean, basically it just wasn't very good, and they didn't want us to leak it, I think, was, you know, so fair enough. But we were effectively working blind, and that was kind of weird in a digital world. So I think, you know, you have the data and you need to use it, but you can't be governed by it.
And I also just want to add that I think this is, it's not a binary choice. It's not as if saying the wise journalists, gatekeepers are going to decide what goes on page one or what leads the broadcast versus being a slave to the digital numbers. It's got to be a combination of those things. But, and I think this, over my long career, I've really come to appreciate, this is why you need a diverse newsroom. Because if in fact we as journalists, as editors, are going to take on the responsibility of deciding, and that's part of what we do, then we really need the input and the perspectives of a variety of people weighing in on that. I mean, I can only tell you, I've been the first woman in my position more times than I can recount, honestly. And I looked at stories differently. I was definitely the first mother in many of my positions, and I looked at those stories differently. And that made me realize that other people who aren't like me or have different backgrounds are going to look at stories differently too. And it's that conversation that I think is really important for us to have, not to give up on the gatekeeper role at all. It's really essential, but to make sure there's a lot of people who are around the table weighing in on that decision.
Thank you for that. Very, very interesting, that concept of kind of how one makes decisions and the kinds of people who do and how much we take audience into account. We've had a question from a journalist in the chat, and she can't put her microphone on, so she's asked me to ask it for her. Samantha, maybe I'll bring Josh in, and no, let's bring Josh in and then Justin on this one, just to finish us up. And she said, you know, when you're doing that, how do you ensure you bring light to a story as opposed to bringing heat to it? And I think that's a really interesting thing, both in terms of news reporting and op-eds, and particularly at the current moment.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I would probably answer it from the perspective of feature writing, and say that someone once taught me that each feature should have an ARC, which is an acronym, ARC, and it should have access, it should have revelation, and it should have conflict. So this is just a useful, I mean, it's obviously not comprehensive, but it's quite useful. So if you think about access, well, it should take the reader somewhere that they couldn't otherwise go. Access to a famous person, access to a place that other people don't see or know. It should have revelation. It should tell them something that the world doesn't know yet, or that wasn't clear, or that's something that the journalist has dug up and revealed about the world. And it should have conflict in that it should seek to address some sort of tension, some sort of difficult question, some sort of moral dimension to a feature. If you can do all three of those, I think you have a really, really stellar magazine feature, particularly if you can write it. So that's just a rule of thumb. But in terms of trying to find light as well as heat, I would say that's quite a useful prism through looking to look at it. You know, if you're actually really going somewhere, revealing something, and then wrestling with a moral dimension, then I think you're beginning to get onto you know, illuminating the world and not just fighting for clicks.
Okay, thank you. Justin, do you feel that the Jewish News' coverage over the last few weeks is bringing light, or bringing heat, or bringing both?
I hope that it's bringing as much light as possible that can get through a lot of heat and a lot of darkness. And as I said earlier on, it's a key focus at the moment to try and bring in as much light and to see elements of nuance where they exist. You know, I think I've been quite shocked by the levels of anti-Semitism, you know, that we must see as latent anti-Semitism that have been awoken in recent weeks. But at the same time, I think we can easily forget the fact that even if we say that 300,000 people on the streets of London last week were all against us, and they all hate us, and they all want us dead, maybe. I don't believe that to be the case, but let's say that was the case. What about the other 65 million people who weren't there? What about those who've been polled in national polling throughout the last few weeks that shows that a majority are still the moderate majority in the middle that don't particularly care, maybe one way or another, that don't have a strong view one way or another? And what about those that, you know, have approached us over recent weeks to convey messages of solidarity, of unity, and again of the unity we've seen within the Jewish community, which I think is unprecedented across the Jewish world in recent weeks. It was the reason that we were able to bring together last week, for the first time in Jewish history, 30 different media outlets to come behind a message that of the fear that's being felt at the moment, but also of the unity. You know, across 7 countries in 3 languages, 30 different outlets all spoke from the same hymn sheet. And there's a reason why that was possible. And it wasn't just because everybody is feeling as fearful as well. A lot of people are feeling as fearful as they are. I just want to very quickly, if I may, end with a little bit of light, seeing as you asked. I was actually going to do this anyway, but you provided a perfect vehicle through which to do it. In the first week of the conflict, I received this email from a member of the Muslim community, a valued contact of the paper. I won't say who it is because, frankly, they didn't want us to publicize it because they feared for their own safety, which isn't particularly full of light. But this is what they said. They said, I pray that you are remaining as strong as you can at such a sad and horrifying time for the Jewish and Israeli people. We would firstly like to pass on our condolences for the terrible loss of Jewish and Israeli life. May their memory be a blessing. We would also like to extend our love and support to you all and reiterate that we stand with you with the same unwavering solidarity that you at the Jewish News have stood with me and my people. Above all else, please know that we are praying for the Jewish and Israeli community, for the safety of your families, friends, and loved ones. Terrorism and hatred will never win, so long as we stand together against it. We stand with you and your people in support always. That was a powerful message that first time I've got through without getting too tearful.
Oh, very, very lovely moment. And it shows the personal side of news as well as the political. So thank you for that. In a moment, I'm going to bring Emma on to do a huge thank you to all of you and to talk about some of the rest of our programme going forward. But I just want to say 2 things. One is to our audience, which is we do have a range of sessions on all sorts of different kinds of journalism over the next few weeks, which Emma's going to talk to you about. But this one was very much about what news is and the context of the newsroom. If you are interested specifically on what is currently happening in Israel, the last session of our course, which Emma will tell you about, is focused on how as Jewish journalists do we talk about Israel to Jewish and to non-Jewish audiences. So there is going to be something that really deals with that. But I just want to make my own thanks to Serena, who, I mean, what you're doing in terms of the digital is groundbreaking and fascinating, and we're very grateful to you for sharing that with us. To Josh and Justin, who are old friends and colleagues of Jewish Renaissance, but it's been fascinating to have an insight into your work. And Jane, like Justin mentioned about half an hour or so ago, or maybe slightly longer, you've been a big hero to all of us working in Jewish journalism. So it is such a privilege to have you on screen with us and to meet you. So first of all, thank you as a woman in Jewish journalism, but also I hope you too, as well as Serena, will stay as part of the Jewish Renaissance family. On that note, Emma, let's bring you in and hand it over to you.
So Aviva said I have to give you a massive thank you, which obviously I do. I don't know that I can top what she's already said, but I firmly echo it. And I'm very honored that we were able to get together such an amazing range of voices who, you know, had so much to share with us. Yeah, I think this has been an incredible evening. And yeah, thank you very much. So moving on to our upcoming events. So next week, Wednesday, 22nd November, we will have Emma Barnett, who is the chief presenter of BBC Radio 4's Women's Hour. And yeah, she will talk about her experiences of interviewing some of the great and good. And then on the 29th of November, we will be looking at podcasting with podcasters Andrew Gold, whose podcast is On the Edge with Andrew Gold, Emma Levy, the host of When Life Gives You Lemons, and Ollie Mann, the host of The Week Unwrapped and Modern Man and Today in History. And then, as Aviva said, we will be moving on to covering Israel for the last of our series. And as she said at the start, this was all planned a long time before the conflict. But we will be delighted to host Richard Ferrer from the Jewish News, Tova Lazaroff, from the Jerusalem Post, Anshel Pfeffer from Haaretz and The Economist, and the session will be chaired by Jonathan Friedland. So if you have more kind of burning questions about Israel coverage, join us for that session. I'll put the link in the chat now. And we also have, on a completely separate note, a session. We have an event in person on the 26th of November, which will be music and poetry at the Museum of London Docklands. And this is to tie in with their Fashion City exhibition. So it'll be looking at clothing through the poetry of some Jewish female poets. So please do join us there. It should be a really nice afternoon. And yeah, that's all from us tonight. So thank you very much to our speakers again, and we hope to see our audience again next week.